Welcome to Grow Virtually, an online horticultural educational program presented by the Master Gardener Volunteers of Cobb County. Under the guidance of the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, we grow gardeners. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to another of the Cobb County Master Gardeners Virtual Education Series, which we call Growing Virtually. Okay, now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Master Gardener Extension Volunteer Guy Van Horn. Welcome, Guy.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to add my welcome to all those who are joining in this evening. We're going to talk about preparing your yard and garden for winter. And for the most part, the presentation will focus on the months of November and December, although we'll touch upon a few things that can be carried forward into other later winter months. But that's where the main focus will be. And I'll also make note that several things get kind of hinged off of when we all get our first frost. And no news to any of you, it's been rather, unseasonably warm up until maybe just the last day or two. But we are, it looks like the forecast is showing we may be flirting with a frost, or at least a light one, even as early as this weekend. So that's just something we'll try and bear in mind as we go through. So what we're going to talk about this evening is number one, as we prepare for winter, what are the benefits of preparations? Because winter does not mean that activities need to stop when it comes to gardening and managing your landscape. So we're going to start with talking a little bit of the benefits of preparation, and hopefully that will answer the why question. Then we'll step through kind of each grouping of flora, from flowers, perennials, and bulbs through to turf, lawn, and grasses. And then I'm going to touch on what might be some suggestions for general maintenance and planning activities that can occur. And again, winter doesn't mean things have stopped. I came across an interview with a horticulturalist who works at a botanical garden, and he was sharing that he had gotten a new boss, and the boss arrived that late fall and asked him, "Okay, what do you guys do during the winter here?" And he said, "Wintertime is when we get all of our work done." And I can kind of relate to that too. If you live in Cobb County or the surrounding area, you know, and you're a gardener, you know that in the middle of summer, you're generally out early trying to beat the heat before noon and when the sun rises and it gets too uncomfortable to work out there. If you're like me, you find yourself saying, well, you know, a few of these other things still need to get done. I'll just wait and do them this winter. Well, now's the time to start kind of planning those activities out. And then planning in general can occur during winter. It's a good time to do that, particularly planning for the next year. And then we'll also touch upon preparing for extreme weather towards the end of the presentation here. So again, what are the benefits of preparation and answering the why? And we need to just recognize that wintertime is really a slowdown and a dormancy. It doesn't mean all of things have died off. It's just a slowdown cycle. So our activities that we are preparing to do need to be aware of that and recognizing that. It's a great time to make sure we're caring for any kind of hardy vegetables that you might have if you raise vegetables, helping them keep growing through the winter months, and be able to obtain more harvests even through to late winter. Another benefit of the preparation is you're just protecting your investment from one year to the next. You may have spent the last year adding in some new trees, some new shrubs, new perennials, and you put time and money into that. So let's protect that. Let's make sure we do things to help those new plantings as well as previous ones get through winter successfully, and again, to protect that investment. Another benefit is that you're helping to enhance the habitat for both beneficial insects as well as beneficial wildlife. And then it goes kind of without saying, you're just also by staying active in the garden and in your landscape, you're getting a jump start on spring, getting a few key things done so that you can move in to that part of next year when activities really start ramping up. So what we'll do is start with flowers, perennials, and bulbs. Um, and when we talk about, well, we'll break it down and talk about annuals and perennials first. When it comes to annuals, key activity is to clean up all the debris that may have occurred through the growing season. But you might want to consider leaving some of those annuals standing unless you're going to replace them. This goes for some perennials too, because they can be beneficial for wildlife, providing both seeds, but for insects as well. And insects such as native bees will actually nest in the hollowed out parts of a stem on a perennial plant. So that's something to consider. When you get into perennials, you might want to selectively prune those plants that are susceptible to diseases that can kick in the spring. Um, Diseases like powdery mildew, and that can affect some key plants such as bee balm, some phloxes, and various hostas. Um, the other thing with perennials is make sure you're supplying their roots with plenty of water during the late fall and early winter, kind of right now, just to make sure that you're protecting those roots and giving them the sufficient water that they need going into the later winter months. And you can also prepare your perennial flower beds and planting areas by, protecting them with mulch or straw as well. When it comes to bulbs, and we'll use bulbs collectively here, which can be not only bulbs, but corms, rhizomes, and tubers, a couple of things can be considered here, a couple of key guidelines. There are several folks that will take their tender bulbs, such as the dahlia in the upper left hand picture, left corner. They will dig those up because a rough winter, if it comes, can be tough on those bulbs. So they'll dig them up after the frost, that first frost, and when the leaves have turned brown, and then store them in a cool place, but someplace that's not too cold, not too cold. Um, Otherwise, for the hardier bulbs like the iris in the bottom picture and others, they're going to winter over, fine. But it's also represents a time to plant, new hardy bulbs that will flower in the spring. Once the soil temperatures are below about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And one thing I will mention about the soil temperature, I've checked here the last couple of days, both at the Kennesaw, Georgia, and the recording station in Dallas, and we're down to about 60 degrees in the first 2 inches of soil. And that's a drop of about 5 degrees in the last 2 weeks. So we are definitely headed below that. So if I back up here, you'll want to make sure that you can, well, if you want to plant those hardy bulbs, you can do it pretty soon. Talking about fruits, vegetables, and herbs now, we'll start with berries, like the raspberries in the upper picture. And it's a good time when you get into winter to start cleaning out the browned blackberry and raspberry canes. Those were canes that probably had fruit on them this year. They are now spent and they can be removed so that the first year canes, which were green and growing this past growing season, have a little bit more room going into springtime. So it's just cleaning out the old, cleaning out the brown, and then come back through and you might want to add a light layer of mulch or straw to those areas just to make sure they're well protected. Also, let's talk about herbs. And this is a little bit like the bulbs in that recognize a couple things. recognize that there's hardy bulbs, or excuse me, hardy herbs, as well as those that are more tender. In the bottom picture, we see some rosemary. Now that's a hardier herb, and it, like sage and like thyme, they generally can winter over no problems. If it's you're seeing some extreme weather coming, you can always dress them up with some mulch or a spread of straw as well. But if you want to try and keep a few of the others going that are more tender, like basil and chives and some others, it's probably best to bring those pots indoors or repot them and then bring them indoors. Now let's talk about vegetables. A lot of activities can occur, preparing the garden for vegetables for the winter. Certainly get dispose of any diseased or pest-ridden type of plants. Get those in a bag and have your waste management take them away. It's also a time that before that first frost, if you have some very tender vegetables, for example, green beans, I grow those in my garden. You get a first frost, and if you cover them, they may make it through a light frost, but if it gets too cold for too long under freezing, it will take them down to the ground. So I have already been out. I was just out this weekend, taking every pot I could get off of my green beans. Maybe I'll get a few more, but in case that frost comes along, I want to make sure I have them harvested. Protect a lot of your winter vegetables, a lot of the leafy greens and a lot of the root vegetables, protect them with mulch, straw, or leaves. They'll be fine out there in most winter, scenarios. They can take a heavy frost, a lot of them, but it doesn't hurt to give them an added measure of protection. And a lot of people will use cloth covers during those periods of hard frost. That gives them a few extra temperature or degree drops of protection. Also, for the vegetable beds, you might want to consider the use of cover crops in those areas that are idle. They do a couple of things. Some of them have blooms, like the buckwheat in the lower right-hand corner picture. It also will provide nectar for pollinating insects. But they, along with some other cover crops like rye or vetch, some of the clovers like crimson and white clover, those they'll not only fill out your beds for the winter or your planting area for vegetables, but they can then be turned into the soil in late winter and just add more nutrients to the soil going into spring planting. So you might want to consider that. But we're now getting to a point where we're getting close to where those soil temperatures could get below 55, and you would have a hard time getting anything germinating after that. For future reference, though, kind of late fall is a good time to consider the use of cover crops. Also in the vegetable garden, if you haven't done it for a couple years, or you've never done it, and you're preparing a garden for, let's say, next spring, you might want to get some soil tests done over the area. Most county extension offices will take care of can take care of this for you. They're great. You get the results back, and you can understand what the nutrient deficiencies are and what may be required to be added, as well as their recommendations from the University of Georgia. So if you have a very basic or higher pH that you need to bring down, you might want to consider adding a sulfur additive. If it's a matter of it's too acidic, your soil, and you need to raise that pH, you might want to spread lime or limestone on it. And this is a great time of year to do that. November and December. I typically will do mine in December. It seems like I'm always adding lime in areas that have been kind of acidic. And it's also a good time just to put down any kind of fertilizers into that soil. That may be a potential planting area for next year. And then it's always good to add organic material into your vegetable beds at this time. It's just it provides more food for the microorganisms in their efforts, as well as other ground-dwelling insects and organisms to turn and prepare that soil and enrich it going into spring. Now let's talk about shrubs and trees. And here's some key guidelines. And if you're like me, you have to revisit this periodically, especially when it comes to the topic of pruning, because it's easy to forget or get it mixed up. And you want to make sure you're not making some mistakes out there. One of the things you can say overall is that you can avoid, and it's suggested you avoid pruning shrubs and trees right before winter, because that may be, while things are still somewhat warm, that could trigger the plant to continue growing, particularly on the top of the plant or the tree. And you don't want it to do that right now. You want it to be preparing itself for for a dormancy or a slowdown during the winter. So avoid the pruning for now. But for shrubs, when you do want to stop and say and answer the question, or say, when do I, or ask, when do I prune them? A couple of key guidelines. If it's a spring blooming shrub like the azalea in the upper right, don't prune it at this time. And that's why you see the X there. For any shrubs that will be flowering this spring up and through, let's say in our area, the month of May, hold off. Wait till those are done and spent, or later in the following year, because you don't want to cut off the buds that will potentially bloom. Now for spring blooming shrubs, summer and fall blooming shrubs, such as the spirea in the lower right-hand corner, those won't be blooming until after May. So you can consider pruning them during the winter, more preferably late winter. But make sure you understand what plant or shrub you're dealing with, because some will recommend that you only clean out the old growth and prune very lightly for in some other areas, because you might want to encourage, you got to make sure that you will be encouraging some of that new growth in spring, so that there'll be sufficient buds going into blooming in the summer. Okay, and then there's some plants and shrubs that require little or no pruning, like camellias, boxwoods, dwarf growth types of plants, and just be very careful that you're not pruning away too much on those types of those types of shrubs in your garden and landscape. And then fruit trees, they're a different topic, but you can prune fruit trees throughout the winter months. It's just recommended that you only do that when the temperatures are above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. During this period of time, also, it's good to follow a rule of thumb that plant any of your new shrubs and trees at least a month before the first frost. And so we're kind of beyond that, but just for future reference, you want to use that 1 month buffer just to make sure that the plant is acclimating to its new location, and things are being done to help benefit its root growth and getting it seeded in the ground going into the later winter months. It's recommended to clear any grass and weeds from around tree trunks that you've planted, or smaller trees, just because they can be inviting little spaces for rodents and rabbits to come in and potentially damage tree trunks. In fact, it's recommended to have about a foot around the tree, if you're going to add mulch, that you leave a bare circle of about 20 inches around, or 12 inches around that tree. Again, just to protect from rodents, particularly mice, getting close to the bark and causing damage. Several folks will consider the use of wraps around particularly young trees. That will also help deter against pests and from any kind of thawing type activity that can harm bark. But going back to the pests, you want to do that. And here in this picture, This is an example of damage done by a deer who had been scraping its antlers on the tree. The wraps may help protect that sensitive bark from the deer doing that. And then also when it comes to shrubs and trees, let's not forget about evergreens. They need water going into winter. They need some help to just make sure their roots are good for the winter, as well as recently planted trees. And that watering should be done deeply until that freezing weather hits. Now let's talk about leaves. Let's just recognize right off the bat that leaves have nutrients in them. They have nutrients that can be used by both wildlife and the soil. Some of you may have compost bins or are planning to have them. It's great to chop up those leaves and add them into those compost piles. They provide a great carbon-rich addition, the brown material to those compost bins. And they're also supplying carbohydrates and food to the microorganisms that are in there that you want to help encouraging their growth and activity so that they can help with the breakdown and the decomposition of the compost pile. But you can also just gather the leaves into piles, not on your yard, get them off the grass, but gather the leaves into piles, and that will also provide a habitat for both beneficial insects and amphibians here in North Georgia. Stepping back about the chopped leaves, if you don't have like a leaf chopper, you can always just run your lawnmower over those leaves and bag them up and then add them to your compost bin. And then the leaves can also be used as a mulch around a variety of plants. I planted my garlic in one of my raised beds in my vegetable garden. I always do it right around Halloween. And I've been chopping up some leaves, and it just made a nice mulch to go back in and lay it around the garlic bulbs where the green has already started to emerge. Now let's talk about turf and grasses. And the picture here is meant to just say that, hey, recognize that your grass is not dead in winter. It's just dormant. In a lot of cases, if it's a warm season grass, or it's in a slowdown, even if it's maybe a cool season grass. So do recognize that. Another key suggestion is to make sure, and I mentioned it a little earlier, rake the last of the leaves from your lawn, because if you leave them just laying there, particularly if they get wet and heavy, they could create dead spots in the lawn going into spring. Where possible, kind of minimize any heavy traffic on that grass while it's in dormancy, because that could damage the plant crowns. Now, most lawns in our geographical area do not need fertilizer during the winter, but that's the warm season grasses like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, centipede, even St. Augustine. They don't really need fertilizer during the winter, but the cool season grasses may require it. And this is where you just need to be aware of the variety or species that's in your lawn, and make sure you read up on its requirements, as well as what some of the fertilizer packaging, what that information will recommend as to when to do it, and if you need that additional feeding during the winter. These 2 months of November and December are great months. As we mentioned, in the garden to add things like limestone, but the yard as well, particularly if you need to raise that pH level for it. So it's just a good time to address those types of things. And also when it comes to turf, and particularly the cool season grasses, you can do some interseeding, as well as for Bermuda grass too, which is possible in November. But you can also do interseeding to help maybe increase the density of the grass headed into the next year. Seeding meaning that you're adding the same species or variety of seed to the existing one. Another thing on the turf and the lawns is weeds. And generally, you want to get your winter pre-emergence for weeds down prior to the month of November. Now, I know it's been warmer lately, but than usual. But the key thing is those pre-emergence need to be down and in the soil prior to when the weeds germinate. Otherwise, they really don't do any good. Um, so it is a consideration if you didn't do it this year or you're having a lot of winter weeds, you may want to get a pre-emergent down prior to November. If you don't, or if you do and you still have some weeds popping up, then you can spot spray them. That is the broadleaf weeds that do come up. Our cool season grasses have maybe some additional weed control recommendations, and that's something to check on as well. And then in addition to your grass and your turf, you might want to also address things in your garden or your landscape, such as uh, grass-like perennials and ornamental grasses. And a recommendation I have here is that you hold off on cutting back those until late winter. And the reasons why is number one, I think it provides some visual texture to the landscape, particularly when other things have stopped blooming or have died down. These can still be out there, adding some again texture to your landscape and your curb appeal. They also provide food for the birds. And even a mostly colorblind person like me can recognize some of them do change colors. And like the muhly grass here in the picture gets to be kind of a nice a red to red purple type of look, as I've been told, and that it just adds some more appeal. So during those winter months. So if you can, maybe just wait till the end of winter before you cut those back. And this is also a great time to remove any kind of invasive vines that have grown into your landscape um, or your garden. Or it's also a good time to remove any kind of outdated ground covers that you're planning to reduce or, excuse me, replace in the next year anyways. So let's talk also about general maintenance and planning. Um, and like I said, this is the time where we can get our work done. But first thing, and probably if you haven't done it already, is shut your irrigation system down, particularly with the low temperature forecasts that are in the works for our area. If you have any garden hoses laying around, make sure they're drained, and if possible, bring them indoors for the winter. November, December, early December, great time to clean and store any containers that may be laying around or seed trays that you've left out. It's good maintenance time for tools and equipment, not only taking care of your garden tools, but your power equipment. You might want to drain the gasoline out of the tanks, drain the oil until spring. Replace air filters and those types of things. And another thought is to make sure you're protecting your yard ornamentals. And we're talking about things like bird baths, urns, jars, a lot of things that may be permeable and that water can get into. And again, that freeze thaw could result in some cracking of those ornamentals. So that's maybe another thing to consider. And be mindful of your outdoor faucets and spigots. If you have any of those with exposed pipes and we get into some really cold temperatures, you may want to put some wraps around those. Wintertime's a great time also to address drainage issues. Maybe you need to consider putting in a French drain or deal with some drainage issues that you've had during the year. Although I recognize that many of us didn't have a lot of rain this past summer, but it can be a time frame to consider those things and to tackle hardscaping type projects, whether you want to put down pavers somewhere or gravel, some type of edging or metal edging and other stones. Wintertime is also the time to continue maintenance of your compost bins and the pot and your compost piles. Don't take your eyes off of it. You know, you might want to make sure that it's getting some water if we are not getting the rains, um, turning the compost bins. You still want to help them along the way, even during the winter months. Also, now is a great time, and this can go even into the middle of the winter. It's a great time for planning your spring and your summer garden, your spring and your summer landscape modifications or adjustments. Whether it may be new beds and spaces that you're considering, getting some repairs done of things in your yard. Maybe you've thought about adding a fence or front fence sections or adding a trellis. Great time to be planning for those types of things, even maybe starting with them if the temperatures cooperate. And then for those of you who like to grow things from seed, you know that at the end of December, the seed catalogs and their digital counterparts will become available. You might want to start considering what kinds of seeds you may want to be growing, whether it's annuals, perennials, and or vegetables, and get your list ready for the first of the year when you might be ordering those. And then also, I think it's a good time to start building up just some supplies for the spring, like mulches, like garden soils, anything you might want to buy in a bag. If you're like me, you kind of also, once we get into late winter, start watching for the sales at a lot of the larger retailers, the discount stores and the home improvement stores. And certainly, you know, they have some great deals that you want to take advantage of at that time. But it seems like I always at least have a need for a bag or two of this or that even before that. So I kind of just build up my inventory a little bit of my supplies, whether it's those bag goods or some other things, in preparation for the next year. Now, preparing for extreme weather, this really starts with just making sure that you select plants that have have a cold tolerance for your area. And you can go out to the United States Department of Agriculture, and you can look up the hardiness zone for your zip code, and then you can match that up when you're selecting plants to make sure they can take some extreme cold or they can't. Another thing, in preparing for extreme weather is just make sure your plants have been getting proper nutrition through the year. A healthier, more nutrition-fed plant is going to do better going into the winter months. You'll want to know what are some of the cold spots and microclimates on your property. Even if you have a relatively smaller piece of property, one corner of it could experience a difference in extreme weather than another. And so you want to make sure that the plants in those areas are properly protected and that you're preparing for that. So what you want to do also is to minimize the radiant heat loss, the loss of heat from the soil back into the atmosphere during the evenings. And so people do this with a number of different devices, whether it's canopies, using covers like in the picture right now in a vegetable garden, mulch wraps, even windbreaks can be helpful because you want to recognize that windy conditions can also mean we're going into extreme weather because they can damage a plant through desiccation, and that is that the water in the plant is evaporating quicker than what it can absorb it due to that wind. You also want to, going into extreme weather, make sure that you've watered before that heavy duty frost because moist soil will absorb more heat and it will help it maintain a better temperature. It will help maintain a better temperature around the plants when those heavy duty cold temperatures hit. And then go out and make sure afterwards that you're assessing for any cold damage and remove any kind of things that are affected like buds, leaves, and stems. So let's just recap a little bit about what we've talked about. We tried to answer a little bit about what are the benefits that flow from preparations, recognizing that there are activities that can be conducted that help protect our plants during that winter time frame. We also want to make sure we're removing any dead, diseased, and unwanted plants during that time. And the next point, the key word here is selectively. So you want to make sure you're selectively pruning depending on the type of plant or the type of shrub, because when you do that is very key depending on that type of flora. So selectively prune, selectively fertilize, selectively apply weed controls, and then of course it's a good time to add soil amendments. Do recognize the many uses of fall leaves that we talked about, and that this is a great time for maintenance and planning. Again, it's when we can get our work done. And then finally, just protection against the cold. Remember that, and some of the key points that we touched on for it. So I've also added here, and you will get these in the email that will be sent out to you with also a list of other resources. Here are some of the references that were utilized to help compile this presentation, the content of this presentation. And then here's a few more things, resources for gardeners, highlighting quite a few things here in Cobb County. But this listing will also be provided in the email that will go out to you for participating in this evening's presentation. So that concludes my presentation for this evening.
We hope that you will find our information informative and helpful. Thanks for watching, and please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel.